I am Naresh Shrestha, Director of ISSR and Chairman of Khabarhub. First of all, I would like to welcome Dr. Roberto De Campo in our venue. Dr. Roberto De Campo is the former Secretary of Finance from Republic of Philippines. I will not talk much about him. Dr. Roberto, I would like to welcome you here, and I hope that during this short visit to Nepal, you must have some good experience and you had chance to have some tourism also. I hope you enjoyed being in Nepal, and we would like to see you back again here. Today, with Dr. Roberto, we will discuss about the experience that he had gained during the Asian economic crisis. And I'm sure that with your statement, we will be highlighted and we will enhance our knowledge for the situation in Nepal as well. In this short notice, this much people that we had, I'm very honored that this high profile people are here with us in today's interaction. We will open floor after Dr. De Campo's statement, and I would like to request Dr. Bindunath Lohani to chair the event. We highly appreciate your valuable time and sharing the knowledge with us. May I request Dr. Bindunath Lohani to take the chair and start the event.
Thank you very much, Nareshji. Actually, chairman of the ISSR, who should have chaired this, he just asked me to do it, and he's such an important figure. If he tells you, I have to do it. So I'm just on the behind. Also, my friend is going to speak, so I am quite happy. And when I look at the audience, I like to really recognize the former minister. My goodness, how many people to recognize? Former chief secretaries, central bank governors, secretaries, president of the Chamber of Commerce, Planning Commission, Bobby, CNI, what is the CNI or CNI?
Nirvana.
Oh, Nirvana. We were together just on that summit, and on and on. So I think my eyesight is good enough just to recognize that. But please consider that I recognize you all, including the staff of this ISSR institutions, who have been always very supportive of this thing. So on behalf of this institution, and which is already welcome, I'd like to briefly introduce Dr. Ocampo. And introducing someone who doesn't need introduction is very difficult. He was the finance minister at a critical time when the financial crisis was happening. I was at the Asian Development, the Vice President Finance Administration. I saw him, how he was handling the Asia-Pacific region. He was the Global Finance Minister of the Year. He was awarded Global Finance Minister of the Year. I think the Euro money also, if my memory goes, also recognized you as the Asian Finance Minister of the Year by the Asia Money. He was the chairman of the APEC and the ASEAN Finance Minister. He was also the chairman of the Development Bank of the Philippines. It's a very important bank of the Philippines. I don't know, Baba, you are Land Bank also, I think, the chairman. Now the Veteran Bank. So he's a veteran in the economic and the financial space and has done many important things. And then he also took a small break to become the president of the Asian Institute of Management, AIM, very respectable institution in the Philippines. I am associated with the Asian Institute of Technology, and this was the other wing. The US at that time thought AIT will be like the MIT and AIM will be like the Harvard. That was the model in those days in the 60s. So Bobby had that, and he also continued to chair. He's the chairman of the board of the Center for Public Finance. It's called RFO, right? RFO, and Regional Economic Cooperation, which I think the ADB Knowledge Hub had some role. I was the vice president for knowledge management after the finance, so I do remember that very well. Well, I can keep on introducing him, then the whole hour will be gone, but I think I better wrap it up by saying that he had many awards like Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, and on and on and on. Most importantly, I think he's a global figure in this. We both are in the Emerging Market Forum, a global forum, think tank forum.
Good afternoon, everyone. I must say that I am almost overwhelmed by the honor of being here in the presence of such distinguished members of both the public and the private sector of Nepal. Thank you very much for this honor. The other honor I'd like to thank you for, and in particular, my good friend Bindu Lohani, is for the honor of being in Nepal for the very first time. And it has been a very interesting experience. I even brought my daughter with me in order to make sure that she can pass on to the next generations the wonderful experiences and sights and uniqueness of your beautiful country. I was here at the invitation of the Summit on Infrastructure in order to give a few remarks on my particular experience with respect to the partnership between the public and the private sector in the building of infrastructure. Interestingly enough, that started in the Philippines, to some extent connected to the Asian financial crisis. In other words, the idea of bringing the private sector into an activity that, as a general rule, is the responsibility of the public sector, meaning the private sector being in partnership with the public sector in infrastructure, was generated to some extent by the experience of the Asian financial crisis. That crisis started in July of 1997. Interestingly enough, that's almost 30 years ago. I was much younger then. And at that time, I was the secretary, we call here Minister of Finance, but it happened to be the Philippines' turn, and therefore my turn, to be the chairman of both the APEC and the ASEAN finance ministers. This crisis was preceded by an era which even the World Bank and the ADB defined as the beginning of the so-called Asian century. They even wrote books about the Asian century and were lauding the rapid economic advance of the so-called tiger economies of Asia, which had followed in the footsteps of an older tiger, which was Japan, and using the model of export-driven growth of Japan, became much more vibrant enough to be called tiger economies. These were Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Korea, and so forth. Interestingly enough, the Philippines at that time, which in the early 60s up to maybe the early 70s was the number 2 economy in that part of the world, next only to Japan, was not listed among the tiger economies, which led me to sometimes joke that we were not a tiger, but we were just a pussycat. But at the onset of the financial crisis, the Asian financial crisis, we determined that from being a pussycat, we would at least aspire to be a tiger cub. And therefore, whenever I would speak before international audiences to persuade them that the Philippines was back in business, and in order to attract investments into the country, I would give the rhetorical question of, wouldn't you rather invest in a tiger cub that is growing into a tiger rather than a tiger that is growing into an older tiger? Now, we had to do many things in order for us to put into place our aspirations of tigerhood. From my own point of view, as finance minister, there were two important things that I could reveal to you. One is the overhaul of the tax system of the Philippines. And the other, which was the subject matter of the summit, was the invitation to the private sector to be a vital partner in the building of infrastructure. On the first one, which had to do with the tax system, my basic principle was the KISS principle. You can either spell that K-I-S, which is keep it simple, or you can spell that K-I-S-S, which is keep it simple, stupid. But I looked at the tax system and tax practices of the Philippines when I came into the ministry and could note that every time there was a fiscal gap in our budgetary aspirations, the legislature, because our political system is much more patterned after the United States, the Congress, Senate, would think of ways to come up with new taxes or their variants to get to the point where we had so many taxes that many of them actually overlapped. Just to give you an example, when I was trying to introduce a much more vibrant tax on alcohol, cigarettes, and the like, which in our country were called sin taxes, I discovered that it was so complex that there was a different tax for alcohol as against, say, spirits, a different tax for alcohol if you purchase it in the city as against purchasing it in the rural area, a different tax if you purchase the same thing either in the city but in a hotel, or outside the city but in a shop, on and on and on like this. So, what happens when you have a system that is so complicated is that it opens up avenues of corruption because of excessive discretion that is built in to those that want to interpret for you, for a fee, how to get the taxes either paid properly or how to get around them. So, keep it simple was what we did. As a result, we diminished the number of, you might say, brackets, tax brackets. There were like 20. And because there were 20, sometimes you'd end up in a situation where a person who's earning something at a certain bracket and then moves up in income to another bracket actually takes home a lower take-home pay. So this was, again, something built through the years of complicating matters rather than keeping them simple. Interestingly enough, I ended up in my tenure with the first revenue efficiency ratio of the Philippines that was at least equal to the best revenue efficiency ratio in the entire region. Revenue efficiency, those of you in finance would of course know, is the ratio of how much you collect as a percentage of your GDP, and we were in the 10% bracket, while everybody else around us was at least 17%. So we managed to bring it to that. At the same time, we ended up with 3 consecutive years of budget surplus, which leads me to the other thrust that we had which was occasioned by our experiences at that time, and that is crafting a policy framework and strategy for having the private sector as a partner in the building of infrastructure. This happened because at that time the government coffers were nearly dry, and we nevertheless had to build infrastructure, and we had to build it at a more rapid pace if we wanted to at least catch up with the countries around us. So you've got a problem of building more infrastructure at a shorter pace, coupled with a situation where you don't have enough finance to do it. And so that's how we ended up inviting the private sector in a public-private partnership strategy in infrastructure. It worked, because the primary infrastructure difficulty we had at the time was the energy sector, where we had brownouts nearly every day, and the only way to get out of it was to finance the building of new power plants, and we didn't have enough funds within the public sector for that. But with the partnership of the private sector, we were able to end that problem quickly enough. So we were going along. I was finance secretary starting in 1993, quite nicely with this game plan. Then, in July of 1997, the Asian financial crisis struck. I mean, I remember being awakened by the central bank governor say, let's meet, there's something going on. And sure enough, that was the Asian financial crisis, which started in Thailand, had a contagion effect, as they put it, on other countries. And as a result, a lot of foreign investments and foreign funds left the region, therefore causing havoc on exchange rates, investment commitments. And part of the result was that most of the currencies of most of the countries in the region deteriorated, and some, like Thailand, tried to defend the currency because they were still in a fixed currency frame of mind, and they tried to defend it to the point where they nearly lost all of their foreign currency reserves. Fortunately for the Philippines, because of what I told you earlier in terms of the reform thrust that we had prior to the Asian financial crisis happening, we were the least affected of those that were involved or affected by the financial crisis. Partly because we did not try to artificially defend the exchange rate, and we just allowed it to float, and we were able to keep it from getting out of hand because we had enough reserves, and we had, as I said, we had budget surpluses, and we were able to establish at least an international perception that we were on the right track. So investors did not abandon us willy-nilly, and instead decided that perhaps if there is a bright light in this entire area that's suffering from Asian financial crisis, it might be the Philippines. Because I was the chairman of the APEC and ASEAN finance ministers, I had to chair the meetings that were to formulate the strategy of how to get out of the Asian financial crisis and how not to come back in. The result of those series of meetings, which included my counterpart finance ministers in Malaysia, Indonesia, and so forth. Interestingly enough, my counterpart finance minister in Malaysia at that time was Anwar Ibrahim, who's now, of course, the Prime Minister of Malaysia. The US, on the other hand, had Larry Summers in order to be part of this discussion of the Asian financial crisis. Well, we were able to craft an outline of how to contain the Asian financial crisis, but that was further expanded in the subsequent meetings in Thailand the following year, which resulted in what was known as the Chiang Mai Agreement. My experiences during the deliberation of the Asian financial crisis, I would say, were mixed. And to some extent, perhaps, some of those experiences might have been the seeds of some of the developments today, where they're talking about BRICS, they're talking about de-dollarization, they're talking about stocking up on gold rather than relying on the US dollar as foreign reserves. What do I mean by the seeds? If we are to look back before the Asian financial crisis, there was already the Enron crisis. But even before that, there was the Mexico crisis. And when the Asian crisis erupted, in discussions with our counterparts from the West, which included World Bank, IMF, US Secretary, Federal Reserve, we were asking for a support fund in order to shore up the finances of the countries affected along the same lines that a support fund was given to Mexico during the Mexican financial crisis. And Mexico received that fund in a relatively short time. Whereas I was practically begging on my knees for such a fund, and instead was being given this runaround, in a sense, of the so-called moral hazard. Moral hazard meaning, if I gave you the fund, things might get worse because you will not manage it properly, since you didn't manage things properly anyway. So this was a big debate. Fortunately, Japan was on our side, and as a result, but it didn't happen immediately, it happened only after much discussion and time. Japan came up with a so-called Miyazawa Fund, which allowed us to shore up. Okay, that was one. But the other is that lessons were learned. One lesson was decreasing total dependence on Western financial resources for generating needed funds. What do I mean? Whenever we wanted to have a big project, either we're going to Western commercial banks or we would have to float Yankee bonds. There was no equivalent in Asia. So one of the lessons learned during that time was perhaps the time had come for us to come up with an Asian bond. There was, of course, the samurai bond, but it was felt that maybe more options could be developed aside from the samurai bond. And actually, one of the chief proponents for this idea of that kind of a bond was no less than the ADB president at that time, who was Mr. Kuroda. At the Chiang Mai Declaration, it was also a lesson that the Asian countries, had to make sure that their foreign exchange reserves were as healthy as they could get them to be. At the time of the Asian crisis, for example, our reserves were only good enough for like 4 months of imports, but just about every country now has gone to at least 1 year of imports and foreign reserves, so that gives us a better shield. Then under the Chiang Mai Agreement, again, this may be seeds of what are happening today, there was the first agreement of currencies swap arrangements among countries so that we could transact to some extent under our own currencies. So the Asian financial crisis was, in a sense, a bit of a shock for us, but also a bit of a lesson to those that were involved, even if they were not in Asia, including perhaps the IMF, because the IMF had, at that time, advised. Their usual advice of austerity, higher taxes, and so forth and so on, which some, looking back to that time, thought that it might have made matters worse than made them better. So those were the lessons learned from the Asian financial crisis. But to our big surprise, in 2008, along comes what was then called a global financial crisis, was actually generated from the United States when big financial entities collapsed. And again, this gave partly a lessons learned and partly a bitter pill. The lessons learned were that in spite of their wealth and apparent expertise, even the mighty can fall. The second lesson learned, unfortunately, was that even those that were practically shoving down our throats the idea of good governance and all kinds of practices about independent directors, on and on, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, had all this in place, and yet. So we again learned lessons from that, which we have, of course, recovered from, but could have been the seeds of some of the unease that is taking place today. In the meantime, the Philippines itself has an economy that is doing reasonably well. The last reading had us at 6%. We continue to use public-private sector partnerships in our infrastructure. I think I said during the summit that when looking at this public-private sector strategy, one of the first things you should ask yourselves is, what is at stake? Well, if you're happy with 2% GDP, fine. But if you aren't, and you don't have enough resources, and you have to get your infrastructure quantity increased at the shortest possible time, then you have to bring together the resources from different places, and that might even include the private sector. You also have to make sure, under this strategy, that you don't end up in a system of too much fragmentation in policy, or else things will not move quickly enough when there are just too many vested interests to satisfy before one can make a decision to move forward. We do have, as well, a foreign policy component, which is a little bit complex, but I will not get into that so that I don't speak too long. And with that, I would be happy to answer whatever questions you may have.
First of all, thank you so much for highlighting on it. We could recall a lot of crises that we all bear during 1997 Southeast Asian crisis, as you rightly said. It's called as Asian contagion. Similarly, as Nepal, India, and China also experienced a lot during the global financial crisis of 1990s. These countries were influenced to bring about massive changes. To recall back what you said probably was as there was the declining foreign reserve in South Asia, East Asian countries like in Korea and Thailand. Thailand was the victim, first on the line, I guess. So they had to devalue it and they had to float Thai baht in 1997. So depending on the preceding years, high growth in these regions, many countries exceeded borrowing that time. And high level of debt was realized, and there had been inadequate financial regulations. I think these were the key reasons why these countries, some took long time to recover, not like the Philippines. So far I remember, Philippines GDP declined by 0.3%, something like that, during the crisis, but it recovered so fast, it was almost by 3% GDP growth. So but this didn't happen in other countries. Southeast Asian 1997 crisis, exactly what happened back in Nepal was increasing economic vulnerabilities because of the inadequate regulations. What I wonder is the recovery in rest of other countries was a bit earlier. But despite the fact Nepal had for many years economic stability, and on the average it was 4% growth for the last 4 decades, but still because of the political instability and vulnerabilities in economic regime, IMF support didn't matter much. So the problem we still have the same, what we experienced during 1997 financial crisis, and then what we experienced during the global crisis, economic crisis of 1990s. The people may say we have a strong foreign exchange reserve at the moment. Key macroeconomic indicators is positive. If you look at the BOP, we have a surplus. If you look at the remittances, its contribution has grown dramatically. But the point is not because the price of the share, for instance, is almost in a bullish trend. But this does not signify, this does not justify that the economy is growing and vibrant. The economic ooze remains the same as it was 2-3 decades ago. So my concern is, bringing about the major political changes also should not be the answer for Nepal's economic ooze. So some balancing between Nepal's top economic priority and then the delayed recovery prescriptions in the future, together with the inter-party consensus development, is the need of the year. If time permits, if I'm here, then I will highlight more on what I said initially. This is my brief comment.
Very much.
Just listening to you.
Looking back at Asian crisis, I had an opportunity to talk with Thanong Bidaya. He was finance minister in Thailand at ADBI. We were together, and also briefly in touch with Anwar Ibrahim at the World Bank. And I used to ask during lunch, the same question. Is there any prepared financial engineering book that holds good for other countries, all other countries? Like what? We felt Thailand's experience at that time was that after the Asian financial crisis, which hit hard to Southeast Asian countries, IMF jumped in with a cookbook. Those who complied with, and all other multilateral financial institutions also jumped in to alleviate from the ooze at that time. But those who complied with IMF's cookbook and put ingredients accordingly, they lagged behind. They couldn't recover quickly. Those who worked on their own, like in Malaysia, they quickly rebound. That means, the nature of crisis is not repeated in history, neither in economic history nor in history of finance. I mean financial history. Therefore, every time we feel different type of crisis, and we have to encounter with those crises, and the root cause of crisis is known by the people there and those who work there. But IMF comes with a general prescription that holds good for every country. That didn't work in Asian crisis, and that was the experience of Anwar and Thanong Bidaya as well. What I see, the countries that quickly recovered is that they were very conservative in nature. They conserved the resources and frugally spent. Those who borrowed from IMF or followed with the standby arrangement of IMF, they didn't care about that, and it took long for them to recover. And in between all these countries, those quickly recovered and the lag behind, Philippines is in the middle. And how do you share? How did you keep balance with IMF's cookbook and your ingredients in the country?
Interesting that you brought that up, because I remember while the Asian financial crisis was raging, that there was also a little bit of a policy dispute raging between Mahathir and Anwar. Anwar at the time was much more inclined to go along with IMF, all right, austerity measures and so forth and so on, whereas Mahathir was not into that. He was much more to defending the ringgit rather than just letting it go. And his point was that the elements that brought the Thailand to the financial crisis was different from the situation of Malaysia, and so why should you have a one-size-fits-all solution? I earlier alluded to the lessons learned, remember? And what I really meant there was the IMF itself has been learning the lesson that one size does not fit all. And to some extent, same with us. And the other is that when managing finance at that time, borrowings, the prevalent battle cry, coming mainly from Western financial sources, was trade, not aid. But they translated that battle cry into, go ahead, borrow from our commercial banks because you're strong enough to pay commercial rates. All right. The others were much more balanced in terms of debt servicing, and you can only balance your debt servicing properly if you have a strong mix of long-term, softer interest rate funding and commercial. What happened in the case of Thailand is that the proportion of commercial borrowing became much larger than they had before, and actually it's the real estate sector that sparked the crisis, because they were lending without the types of regulations that I think one of you alluded to. And one of the regulations that eventually put in place, which was in place with us, is that banks should have limits of lending per sector. So if you pour all your money into one sector and that one sector collapses, then you're in trouble. So in our case, for example, we do have limits on the real estate sector. So the other thing that we put in place this is not so much a rule book, but as an avoidance scheme, was to have you might say, a continuous monitoring system of what's happening in the various economies around, in order that you can flag difficulties before they become crisis. And I was the instigator, believe it or not, of putting that monitoring mechanism into ADB, whereas the big push was to put it in IMF. I said, this is an Asian crisis. You have to get an Asian institution to be the one to understand what's going on in Asia. Fortunately, it pushed through that way, even though with the IMF. So, as I said, yeah, one size does not fit all. And in our particular cases, we acted to some extent differently depending on our situation. But as a general rule of prudent national fiscal management of your borrowings, it isn't just the size of the borrowing or its percentage to GDP that counts. It's really the size of your debt service payment that counts. And your debt service payment becomes much more manageable if you're blending long-term funds rather than stacking too much short-term funds.
Can we draw parallels between what was done in Thailand to defend the currency, which was weakening day by day, and the capital control measures introduced by Mahathir in Malaysia? It was also very controversial. As far as my simple knowledge and experience goes, despite being a controversial decision, the decision of Mr. Mahathir regarding capital control measures introduced in Malaysia then was not bad. It didn't do much harm to the economy, as was the case in Thailand. So I would like to hear a little bit from you on this front. Another issue I would like to raise is that many countries learned good lessons from the crisis in 1997. If I remember correctly, my friends who also work for the central bank of this country will correct me if I'm wrong. We were on the verge of introducing capital account convertibility because India was feeling very comfortable with its solemn, reserves of foreign exchange. We were quite comfortable then, as we are now today. So we thought India was on the verge of declaring capital account convertibility, and without wasting time, we thought we would follow their footsteps. But after the crisis, we became very, very careful. We decided not to do it. This crisis, you see, in 1997 stopped us from declaring capital account convertibility in Nepal. I think Indian authorities also learned good lessons. So now, in retrospect, 24, 25 years passed, still we have not given serious thought about capital account convertibility. I think it's a good decision. We learned a very good lesson in Nepal also. One more query, I have is regarding the role of China. You very rightly pointed out that the crisis taught us, more specifically the Asian countries, not to rely more on Western funds in times of emergencies or when you are badly in need of funds, external funds. You learned a lesson. What was the role of China? I don't know. Was it of any help? Because, I also would like to recall my experience, discussing and dealing with governors of Southeast Asian and East Asian countries. We used to have Session Governors Conference annually, And in the beginning, we used to talk about the markets of Asia being flooded by Chinese goods and other things, you see. We're scared of China. One day I casually spoke and I observed, you see, China is flooding our markets with Chinese goods these days. But days are not, you see, far ahead when China will be assisting you. It will be importing a lot from our countries as well. So we have to have good production. You have to strengthen your production base. Then after that, I think what I spoke then casually came true. I think Philippines and even Japan, you see, got some support, which was expected through huge imports of goods from Japan and the Philippines as well. Even the United States of America, if I remember correctly, suffers huge trade deficit with China. But if you look at service trade, I think United States of America and so many other countries, have service trade surplus with China. What is the situation on the trade front between China and the Philippines? So I will be very happy to listen to you. Thank you very much.
My question is regarding the current situation. After COVID-19, major changes in economic strategy of all the countries. Self-reliant economy is only permanent strategy which can maintain growth rate of every country. This rising geopolitical tensions, climate change are resulting to breaking the supply chains at this moment. Success of self-reliant economy strongly depends on competitive financial environment. How South Asian countries can develop self-reliant economy in current surgical financial stress in the world? Will the current surgical financial stress will be over in coming few years, or it will continue for long time?
All right. First, the comment on capital controls as against floating the currency, etc. There are two notable phrases to remember on the Asian financial crisis. One I had already mentioned, which is the so-called contagion effect. The other one that is worth remembering, but it also sprung up a little bit during that time, was herd mentality. I think the problem really was on both sides. Those that were invested in countries here in Southeast Asia from, say, the West, and profiting from it because they were now investing in the so-called tiger economies, suddenly ran out as fast as they can on the escape door at the instance that one of the tigers tripped up, and that precipitous exit was responded to by Thailand by means of trying to defend their currency. The others had the same kind of herd mentality that followed that model. Malaysia was different. It decided that it was not going to follow a herd mentality because they did not have the roots of the Asian crisis, meaning to say the financial excesses of lending in the real estate sector and so forth. So why will they allow a herd mentality to go to the escape hatch just because they suddenly decided that the entire region was collapsing? Well, as you rightly pointed out, at that time, capital controls were, after the fact, looked at as the more correct thing to do than a defense of currency. As a result, however, of the discussions in the Chiang Mai Agreement and so forth, many other elements were put into place because you have to balance between the need to have a strong reserve to defend your currency and the need to continue to signal to the investment community worldwide that not only do you have the bullets to defend your currency, but you have the economic framework in place to avoid a herd mentality, and they will look at your economy on a specific basis before they say that we're all out of the entire region. I think that's what is taking place right now, which is why many of the countries here in the region are trying to enforce fiscal management and monetary management policies that would allow them not to end up at, you might say, the brink. At the same time, I did indicate that we put in a monitoring mechanism that was housed in ADB, so that before one gets to the precipice, there are enough warning signals to be able to analyze whether this is localized or whether this is not, and if it's localized, what are the applicable measures to put in place rather than pressing a panic button. Now, at the time the financial crisis took place, interestingly enough, China wasn't as big as it was today. In fact, I remember that one of our first major meetings after the financial crisis struck was in Hong Kong. That is actually when I held my discussions with, the likes of Alan Greenspan and so forth and so on about the financial crisis. But that was also the time when the British had to exit Hong Kong as the, whatever you call it, the manager of the entire place. And it's from there onwards that, but not just because of Hong Kong, that China began to grow in strength, so that it is probably looked at as the first economy almost in history that lifted 800 million people out of poverty in 25 years. Now, did they do this unfairly? Were they stealing technology from the West in order to come? There seems to be that accusation. But if you look at it from a broader perspective, I think the West voluntarily transferred its industry to China in the search for lower cost labor, so that Apple, name it, they didn't name any big entity, transferred. What many forgot was that China was not just your run-of-the-mill poor country, but it was one of the world's oldest civilizations that had invented the likes of gunpowder, printing, porcelain, on and on and on. And so they began to learn the technology that was transferred to them voluntarily and actually improved it to the point where they became the manufacturing hub of the entire world, and in a system that later on developed to be one of connected supply chains, they became the manufacturing integrator for the whole world. I mean, a country like the Philippines could produce one of the parts, Malaysia will produce another part, and the whole thing comes together as a flat screen TV or whatever you want to call it from China. They have become wealthy enough so that it would seem that they are embarked on a policy of extending their trade capabilities all over the world to be the number one trade partner of just about everybody. Now, what do you do with something like that? You mentioned the phrase self-reliant. Should a country try to be self-reliant? I think you should forget that phrase. There is no such thing. And it is a nice political phrase, just like in the Philippines, every politician that wants to be president talks about, let us be self-sufficient in rice. I think that's a total myth and an outright lie to the public. But I guess it works. It always sounds good to look like you're tough and you're going to do it, so forth and so on. I think that as the global developments continue to evolve, it is not so much self-reliance, but your ability to be flexible enough to open your opportunities of trade and finance and not put all your eggs in one basket. Right now, if China's offering, why not? The US offering, well, yeah. If India's offering, fine. But it would be, I think, a serious mistake for a country to position itself in one basket under the present set of circumstances. To some extent, I have some, what should I say, misgivings of the Philippine policy vis-a-vis China, because they give the impression, sometimes, I don't know if it's a transition, of putting eggs in one basket, although I'm quite happy to learn that during the past week, the Deputy Foreign Minister of the Philippines met with the Deputy Foreign Minister of China, and I'm hoping that that is a signal that we're going to try to resolve our territorial disputes by negotiation rather than force.
You have worked under, I can understand, under at least two regimes, Ramos and Aquino. Okay. When it comes to private sector engagement, investment, and relationship with the state, we have a couple of things that keeps on coming up, kind of tricky things, like soft state syndrome. Your state is too soft. That kind of syndrome, it used to be repeated again and again after the 1990s, when we tried to partner with the private sector for investment or development partnership with private sector in different sectors. Then another issue that comes up, comes keeping up, even now, it reverberates, is global private sector versus national private sector. What are you talking about? These are the type of things that keep on coming. And then when we discuss some of these frameworks that we have in place for investment, like BOT, BO, BOT, whatever, the question of trust between private sector and state fairly keeps coming up. I have one, and sometimes it implies this kind of narratives and concerns imply what kind of regimes you prefer when it comes to private sector's choice for investment. And often in countries like ours, sometimes they come up with the conclusion maybe authoritarian regime is better. So my question to you, Your Excellency, is what has been your experience? How did you build your trust under this different regime? And then how do you see the kind of relationship we might be able to develop in this century, not the 90s, this one, where the trust between private sector, state, is not as we could see during the liberal period. It's a very a different constraint, different type of constraints that are there. I stop here. Thank you so much, sir.
Today, what I see that important economic and trade-related agendas are discussed outside the multilateral forums, established multilateral forums, loose forums like G20, BRICS, APEC and others are, being very prominent in defining the contours of world trade, economy. You also mentioned about kind of love and hate relationship with IMF, and there is a strong voice that the existing global financial and monetary architecture is not inclusive, is not representative, so we need reform, broad-based reform in the system. If that is the situation, then what would be your suggestion, whether the world is ready to volunteer to take a new course of action in terms of defining a new financial and monetary architecture globally, or still there is enough room to improve, reform it, and continue with the existing system? So what are the possibilities on both sides? Thank you.
Let me start my response to your question by mulling on your phrase, soft state. I think in the UK sometimes it's referred to as a nanny state. A soft or a nanny state is kind of looked upon as a state that thinks that it is their responsibility to provide just about everything to every citizen. Free this, free that, free education, free health, and on and on and on and on. Very attractive to politicians, but most of the time it leads to a very difficult fiscal situation which cannot be supported by the tax system until the entire thing becomes problematic and collapses. Okay. The reason why the input of private sector may be worth considering under such circumstances is something I alluded to during my own remarks at the summit. I said that one of the things you might want to learn, or at least keep in mind, is the difference between the responsibility of the state as a provider and the responsibility of the state as an enabler. If I were a politician, I'd love the first one, because I'd have all my constituencies thanking me for everything I promise, whether I deliver or not. But I put myself in position like God. I am giving you this, I'm giving you that, so thank me, thank me, thank me, in exchange for votes. But if the entire national frame of mind is thinking in terms of rising tides lift all boats, then it might be a better idea to position the policy of government as enabler much more than provider. I'm not saying that these are mutually exclusive, but one should have an appropriate blend. So, for example, in infrastructure, I did say during my talk that it is still, as a general rule, the responsibility of the state to be able to indicate what is the overall national plan for whatever infrastructure. And then the second part comes in implementing that infrastructure so that it is done as efficiently as possible with the right blend of finance and management and so forth. That would benefit the ultimate beneficiaries, whether or not there is political attribution. After all, when the entire economy is uplifted, as I said, all a rising tide will will lift all boats. Now, the blend between the private and the public sector It's rather like a husband and a wife. It is never totally peaceful. You have to always come up with some kind of a compromise and modus vivendi, because the private sector would want a good rate of return for the risks it is undertaking, and the public sector would want to make sure that they're not spending, that they're not enriching that private entity, while at the same time trying to fulfill an interest. So there's a balancing act here, which is why a starting point, I think I referred to this also, is the crafting of a legal framework so that it is very clear to the government what their parameters are, and it is also clear to the private sector what the negotiating parameters are. And of course, these are later on perfected in contractual arrangements, depending on what kind of contract you come up with, be OTB or the variants. But the one risk that government should avoid is moving the goalposts after the game has begun. In other words, if there is a legal framework and you've got a contractual obligation, the government has put in its part, the private sector puts in its part, don't find yourself in a position that just because a new administration comes in, they're going to throw all that in the wastebasket and come up with new rules. Because that is going to sacrifice the credibility of the nation itself in front of all investors, whether local or global. And you did mention this business about global and local investors. You'll have to attract both, you see, because the local investors may not be able to come up with everything you need in terms of financing, capability, blah, blah. And most of the time, even in our experience, you end up with partnerships of global and local, but the name of the game still is at least a good degree of clarity and a long-term stability of the relation, without which it's not going to work. And if it doesn't work, then if you're happy enough plodding away at slow infrastructure building, which will not lift your boats, then fine. But if you're not satisfied with that and you need to muster more resources, then at least give this a shot. There are many things that the government has to put into place to make it worthwhile for the private sector. For example, right of way. This is always a big deal issue in national highways. For example, zoning. This is a very important, but you have to tackle the issue and put sensible legislation in place so that it is very clear what the parameters are. Now the other thing, yes, IMF. Oops. Already there are new institutions that have come up. Particularly the AIIB and the New Development Bank. To some extent, these institutions were a product of frustration, because it had long been put on the table the question of why should the World Bank always have a United States person as its president, number one. Why is the system of voting in order to have a higher level of influence such that you have G7 countries who are far less influential or economically powerful than, say, India or China, and yet they can never get in? Okay. Why is the IMF head always from Europe? And the same question. So it did give the impression that the reason these whys were not answered to the satisfaction of many is that it was a closed ball game. And if you keep banging your head against a wall trying to convince a closed ball game to open up, then you either get severe bumps on your head or you go some other way and present an alternative. That alternative cannot be feasible if the parties involved in it have no economic clout. But now they do. You're looking at Russia, which, according to IMF itself, has now become the fifth wealthiest economy in the world, despite the war and the sanctions and so forth. And then there's China, and then India coming up. And all these countries put together represent a humongous percent of the global population and the global GDP, so that collectively their voice is much more heard. Now, I don't know if the World Bank and the IMF will consider eventually transitioning as well to opening up to a wider group of countries that have achieved significant economic success enough to be at the table. I mean, even if you just look at G7, they took Russia out, but Russia is now number 5. India is probably richer than Italy. So these I think are not going to stop. For me, it's more IMF and World Bank's move to make themselves a little more open and therefore to some extent more relevant in a geopolitical setting that is definitely evolving to a much more multi-polar situation. And then, of course, aside from institutions themselves, there are, you might say, geopolitical strategies, among them the Belt and Road Initiative, which are quite tempting to many and are probably worth a close look by any country that believes, and rightly so, that improving and forging ahead at the highest possible speed with infrastructure and modernization could consider that as a possible source. As I said before, without giving the appearance of having put all your eggs in one political basket.
मेरो यहाँ उपस्थिति मेरा आफ्नै कुराहरू राख्ने भन्दा पनि मैले जुन किसिमको कसको यहाँ उपस्थिति हुन्छ भनेर मैले नरेशजीलाई सोध्दाखेरि जुन जुन नामहरू उहाँले दिनुभयो उहाँहरूको कुरा सुनेर केही लाभान्वित हुने दृष्टिकोणले पनि म यहाँ उपस्थित भएको छु र उहाँको कुरा महत्त्वपूर्ण उहाँले आफ्नो विचार राख्नु भएको छ त्यसबाट पनि म लाभान्वित भएको छु र हामी सबै लाभान्वित भएका छौँ भन्ने मलाई लाग्छ। नेपालको सन्दर्भमा अहिले हामीले नेपालको आर्थिक अवस्थाको बारेमा यहाँ धेरै चित्रण गरिरहनुपर्छ जस्तो मलाई लाग्दैन। अहिले हालसालै एउटा बलियो सरकार निर्माण भएको छ र अहिलेको हाम्रो चुनौती अर्थतन्त्रलाई कसरी चलायमान बनाउने र दिगो आर्थिक विकासका लागि कसरी वातावरण तयार गर्ने यसका निमित्त सरकारले जुन प्रयत्न गरिराखेको छ त्यो प्रयत्न परिणाममुखी बनाउनका निमित्त र खास गरेर दीर्घकालीन आर्थिक विकास र स्थिरतालाई सुनिश्चित दिने अहिलेको चाहिँ हाम्रो कर्तव्य हो र त्यो कर्तव्य पालना गर्नका निमित्त उहाँको के सुझाव र अनुभव छ यही कुरा म राख्न चाहन्छु। अरू धेरै कुरा मैले यहाँ राखिराख्नु पर्छ जस्तो मलाई लाग्दैन। धन्यवाद।
It's difficult for me to tell you what to do. I'm not that familiar with Nepalese economy or politics, but the starting point for any economy to be able to move forward is a definition of two important things. One is its relative advantage, and the second is its national interest. Relative advantage means what are the elements of your geography, your natural resources, that would allow you to put focus on a particular set of sectors more than you would other sectors. So, for example, I understand from reading the history of it all that Lee Kuan Yew didn't start by just dictating to everyone to behave. No, he started with a clear idea of what was his island's comparative advantage, and it was at that time ports. So he put a lot of his focus on developing the ports, and that became the seed for the development of the sustainable finance needed to develop the rest of the economy. Now, what is your answer to that? Of course, it may not be just one thing, but each country has its uniqueness, and therefore would have to start by identifying what that uniqueness is, whether it is in mineral resources, whether it is in tourism. What are the main drivers? What are your locomotives that will drag the rest of the train along forward? And of course, I did say the identification of national interest, but that probably becomes much more important in a country like Nepal, which has on its borders two powerful countries, plus the continuing interest of powerful Western countries. So that's what, as I said earlier, it would be probably important whenever a proposition comes from any of these that you examine it in the context of what you define to be your national interest.
Very deep question. Let me try to extract more from you. I lived in Philippines for 30 years, so I've seen some of those. I think if I tweak the question a little bit to get more information, I know back in the 60s, Philippines was number 2 economy in Asia Pacific. It was only next to Japan. It was a center for banking, center for education, center for agriculture, and for you name it, most knowledgeable people. And then suddenly we went down. I say we because I lived 30 years longer than Nepal. So what happened? Why we went that way and now slowly again emerging, trying to catch up? So that experience, whether it was the economy, whether governance or the political, with all the reason, that would be very revealing. You see, we had the same situation like 40 years, I think 3 to 4 decades, 4% growth, and then we've stayed like that. You had so high, went down, and you're going up. So what that experience, I think, is very, very relevant in today's situation, because you did go through the political difficulty, you did have the insurgent, you had some wrong investment, the FDI did not come in, some of the existing industries moved out. So if you could sum up that from your experience as a finance minister.
Let me put it this way. The father of the present president, because of the insurgencies of that era that were keeping the country from moving forward rapidly, decided to declare a variant of martial law. Interestingly enough, during that period between 1972, I think, and 79, the country's economy moved very, very rapidly, to the point where the World Bank and the IMF decided to have their annual meeting in Manila. All kinds of international hotels came up, the economy was booming, and so forth and so on. Now, what happened? Why did it all collapse? I think partly because that president read the problem of the society well enough, but then tried to implement a solution that turned out to be selfish. What did he read? He read that the society was oligarchic. And so he wanted to make it less oligarchic. What mistake did he make? He tried to replace the old oligarchy with his own chosen oligarchy, which were known then as cronies. And unfortunately, even though the identified engines of growth were sound, they were handed over to cronies who then raided the financial coffers of the country, leading to his ouster and back to, quote-unquote, democracy. But it wasn't that easy, because from a centralized framework, it became much more random and less easily manageable. So we are now reaching you might say, the mid-ground of maintaining a much more democratic system, while at the same time putting into place good governance measures, which are not perfect and are not completely followed to the letter, but at least allowing much of the public to be conscious of what these are, and to be able to measure politicians' promises and actions much more within a framework of a common belief of what constitutes good governance. I don't know to what extent this applies to the situation of Nepal. Yeah. For example, I understand that 10% of your population are overseas workers, and therefore quite a chunk of your finances come from remittances. Believe it or not, it's the same in the Philippines, where more than 10% of the population is working abroad, partly because the wages are higher, and where remittances become a... Now, are we going to lament that as pure brain drain? Or are we going to try to put into place some measures that would allow the value of overseas workers to be much more than rudimentary labor? So many of the people now going out from the Philippines are not just digging dirt in some desert. They are qualified nurses, they're educators, they're engineers, but that's partly because we had put into place educational systems and curricula that would bring them up to a higher level of capability and therefore worth. And so that to some extent, that becomes more of comparative advantage.
Plus minus 1 minute. I'll take 4 minutes. Because ADB was mentioned several times, I must say a few things, and then I'll give it to Naresh to close. At the time of the Asian financial crisis, I was the Vice President of Finance at the Asian Development Bank, so I had some obligation. I am not going to put facts, data, because those are well published. By now, ADB has published so much, the world has published, there's enough. What I'm going to say is some of the informal discussions we had, which is not recorded, just like Bobby knows, I know. One, when the Thailand crisis came in, I do remember IMF guys saying, don't worry, we know how to do all this crisis, balance of payment, we've done Argentina, etc. Don't worry. I'm not trying to take the credit. Our people, especially our president, who was a very good macroeconomist, he said, I think this time the crisis is different. He said it's a capital currency crisis. And being a small bank, nobody gave any importance to what we said. That's the disadvantage sometimes of being small. Even if you're right, sometimes you're not listened to. We did say that, and what came out, as you know, the IMF assessment on the Thailand was wrong. The size was wrong. The size of the problem, they said, oh, 15 billion, 17 billion, they said nothing. It was all wrong. We know that later. Bobby, correct me if I'm wrong. At the time, the Asian countries were so frustrated. I give you a couple of examples. Organizations like ADB would try to help the private sector, some of the banks which were failing, etc. There was a lot of resistance from the G7, particularly one or two countries. How can you bail out these banks? Let's put them to sale so that the international countries from the Western world could buy it at potato prices. We tried to save that. We got a lot of blame for that, for being so easy. We provided $4 billion to Korea. Not that they needed to use it, they needed that dollar backup so that they can survive. That was criticized. How can we give such cheap interest money to a country like Korea? All of this suffering, I think we know. We even at the moment, we including the many countries, thought of, Bobby, you may remember, let's have an Asian Monetary Fund. Remember that? And there was a lot of informal discussion, but there was, of course, the very big pressure from a country, and I also think a very strong country in the region could not put up with it. So it is partly our weakness of one of the very rich country in Asia, and also the strong country. It didn't happen. But around that AMF, because it didn't happen, many things came in. The Chiang Mai initiative, pooling of the resources, Asian monitoring, Asian monitoring and financial institution, which we still have in Singapore, and many things came out of that. One thing that you briefly mentioned, I will again mention, the swap arrangement was one of the beautiful things that happened in addition to making swap. That you and I are trading two countries, you give me in rubles, I give you in this. You give me in RMB, I'll pay that. And why not? If the trade is bilateral, why not? I believe, even today, we should be looking at this swap today. If I have a $100 million trade to country B and A, and I'm exporting 80, you can always have $80 billion swap. Right? This is something we need to explore, and I think some countries now are doing it, particularly in the context of the oil. The other thing that I think I'm not trying to praise ADB, one of the things we did very good was the trade financing. Nobody would take the letter of credit from the banks. Nobody would and the Asian countries, the banks really suffered, including Nepal. So the trade financing really saved many. We became actually the de facto guarantor of all the payments required by the banks. And the last thing I would say is, after that, there's a lot of work starting happening on regional cooperation and integration. This was really ADB. I don't want to take the credit because it's under my department, but I will still say it was a very good initiative required. It was done, and I will continue. Now, the next question is what Shankarji read, and Bobby nicely said. I'm of the view that the world economy has already fragmented or is fragmenting. There are three models for the monetary system. It may or may not happen looking at the future. One, we know after the China started making his presence military in the South China Sea. After the Russia invaded Ukraine, looking at some of the Middle East countries, and if you watch one of G20s today, they have really fragmented into three economies. You have Russia, China, Saudi Arabia into one camp. You have the G7, the EU, and the Australia in one camp. And you have the third group, which is Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, Korea, Indonesia, India, Turkey, South Asia. So of the 20 countries, you can see three economies. But also important to think about is the BRICS angle now, because some of these countries are going into a group, the Russian-China group. So we see the emerging of the BRIC economy as being an alternative to the G7 economy, and I think there is a little bit of the possibility of some fragmentation of the economy on this one. And some of the things which I think the G7 countries did by completely expulsion of the SWIFT, Russia to this, I mean, some of the actions are really, in my opinion, now I couldn't say that in ADB when I was at staff, now I can say it's totally, in my opinion, out of line. It's already happening. We all know that China has started using the RMB for oil imports. We also know from Russia and Saudi Arabia, so they are already trading this along the swap line I mentioned, and I think more such things will happen with this fragmentation there. The second possibility is a multiple currency system with central bank digital currency. I think this is, people see as a potential for future. Once you have a digital currency, just like we have the money in the phone, when I think it will make this kind of thing extremely possible, and what is foreign exchange after that? So that is the second kind of fragmentation we see. The third is, which we all have been arguing for a long time, probably, is the SDR-centered international monetary system, SDR, the IMF. Many countries like it, some is already happening. This is a possible tool where a country like China would like it because they are a huge economy and they would have in that basket have a say. Even we could have a small say someday. If all the countries have a say, this could be. But still there is a lot of opposition by a few very strong economy. But I personally think I'll be very happy if this materializes. With this, I would like to pass on to Nareshji, who has got the final say. Yeah.
Thank you very much, sir. First of all, I would like to apologize with Shankar sir, Vinod sir, Keval sir, Nirvan ji, Dipendra sir, Manohar sir, Ravi sir, Shishir sir, I don't know, Lal Shankar sir, Madam, Kusub madam. The main reason that I have to apologize is that because of time concerns, we couldn't get your questions, or we couldn't get your words. Please bear with us.